Your retirement bonus has been denied due to budget constraints, Human Resources Director Catherine Walsh said, barely looking up from her paperwork. Furthermore, your position will be filled by a logistics consultant to modernize our operations. I sat there in stunned silence, my hands gripping the arms of the uncomfortable plastic chair. 28 years. 28 years I had given to Bramthorne Legal's warehouse operations in Salt Lake City, Utah, and this was how they were sending me off. My name is Darlene Whitaker, and at 63 years old, I thought I had seen every corporate betrayal in the book. But this one cut deeper than I expected. The retirement bonus I had been counting on, the one written into my contract, was being swept away like yesterday's dust. Budget constraints? I repeated, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. Catherine, I have been managing this warehouse since before half the executive team was even hired. My systems have saved this company hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. Catherine finally looked up, her expression cold and dismissive. Darlene, we appreciate your service, but times have changed. We need fresh perspectives and modern approaches to logistics management. I felt my jaw clench. Fresh perspectives. As if my decades of experience meant nothing. As if the accident-free record I had maintained for over 10 years was somehow outdated. As if the inventory systems I had personally designed and implemented were relics of the past. Who is this consultant? I asked, though I already suspected the answer would irritate me further. Blake Morrison from Trenwick Consulting, she replied, a hint of excitement creeping into her voice. He specializes in warehouse optimization and digital transformation. Very impressive credentials. Blake Morrison. I had heard whispers about him in the break room over the past few weeks. Young, flashy, expensive. The type of consultant who promised revolutionary changes while charging premium rates for ideas that anyone with real warehouse experience could have told them for free. And my bonus? I pressed, determined not to let this slide without a fight. Catherine shuffled through her papers again, clearly uncomfortable. As I mentioned, budget constraints have made it impossible to honor that particular aspect of your contract. The company is going through some financial restructuring, and non-essential expenditures have been suspended. Non-essential. My retirement bonus, earned through nearly 3 decades of dedicated service, was now classified as non-essential. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a familiar feeling I had learned to recognize over the years. It was the same feeling I got when I spotted discrepancies in inventory reports, or noticed safety violations that others had missed. It was the feeling that told me something was very, very wrong. But I kept my expression neutral, even managed a small smile. I understand completely, Catherine. These things happen. The relief on her face was almost comical. Walking back to my office for what would be one of the last times, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. I had started at Bramthorne Legal straight out of high school, back when the company was just a mid-sized law firm with a single warehouse location. Over the decades, I had watched it grow into one of the largest legal services companies in the western United States, with warehouses in 4 states storing everything from archived case files to office supplies. My late husband Thomas used to joke that I cared more about that warehouse than I did about our living room. He wasn't entirely wrong. I had poured my heart and soul into building something that worked, something that lasted. Every process, every safety protocol, every efficiency improvement bore my fingerprints. The relationships I had built over the years ran deep. Jacob Williams, who started as a floor associate 15 years ago and now managed the entire night shift, had learned everything from me. Patricia Evans, the inventory specialist, still used the filing system I had taught her during her first week 8 years ago. Even the newer employees knew that when they had a problem, they came to Darlene. But it wasn't just about the personal connections. It was about the systems themselves. The inventory tracking process I had developed reduced loss and theft by 30%. The safety protocols I had implemented hadn't just prevented accidents. They had earned the company recognition from the State Occupational Safety Board. The loading dock scheduling system I had created increased efficiency by 25% while reducing overtime costs. All of this would now be handed over to Blake Morrison, a consultant who had probably never spent a full day on a warehouse floor in his life. I had seen consultants come and go over the years. They arrived with their PowerPoint presentations and their buzzwords, promising to revolutionize everything. They would spend a few weeks observing, another few weeks analyzing, and then present their findings as if they had discovered something revolutionary. Usually, their recommendations were variations of systems that were already in place, dressed up in modern terminology, and sold back to management at premium prices. The irony was that most of these consultants had no real understanding of the day-to-day challenges of warehouse operations. They saw numbers on spreadsheets, not the human beings who made those numbers work. They understood theory, not practice. But what Catherine Walsh and the executive team didn't realize was that I had been preparing for this day for a very long time. Not this exact scenario, but something like it. I had learned early in my career that in corporate America, loyalty was a one-way street. Companies expected it from their employees, but rarely returned it when times got tough. That was why, 15 years ago, when I had negotiated my last major contract renewal, I had insisted on certain protections. Protections that I had never mentioned to anyone, not even Thomas. Protections that were about to become very relevant. As I reached my office, I could already hear Blake Morrison's voice carrying down the hallway from the conference room, explaining to a group of managers how he planned to optimize their operational paradigms. The next morning brought Blake Morrison's official introduction to the warehouse staff. At 34 years old, he had the kind of polished confidence that only came from years of telling people how to do jobs he had never actually done himself. His navy suit was perfectly pressed, his hair professionally styled, and his smile practiced to convey just the right amount of authority, mixed with approachability. "Good morning, everyone," he began, addressing the group of 20 warehouse employees who had gathered in the break room. "I'm Blake Morrison from Trenwick Consulting, and I'm here to help modernize your operations and bring Bramthorne Legal's logistics into the 21st century." I stood at the back of the room, watching the faces of my colleagues. Some looked skeptical, others resigned. They had seen this show before, just with different actors. Blake clicked to his first PowerPoint slide, which showed a generic warehouse layout with arrows and buzzwords scattered around it. "What we're looking at here is a complete transformation of your current processes. We'll be implementing cutting-edge inventory management software, optimizing your floor layout for maximum efficiency, and establishing new performance metrics that align with industry best practices." Jacob Williams raised his hand. "What about the systems we're already using? Darlene spent years developing our current processes, and they've been working pretty well." Blake's smile never wavered, but I caught the brief flash of irritation in his eyes. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need to move beyond," he replied smoothly. "Old-timers like Darlene don't understand modern logistics. Her outdated methods were holding you back from reaching your true potential." The room fell silent. Several people glanced back at me, expecting some kind of reaction, but I just smiled and nodded, as if Blake had complimented my work instead of dismissing nearly 3 decades of it. "The reality is," Blake continued, gaining momentum, "that what worked 10 or 20 years ago simply doesn't cut it in today's competitive environment. We need dynamic systems, real-time analytics, and adaptive workflows. The old way of doing things, with its paper trails and manual processes, is like trying to compete in a Formula One race with a horse and buggy." More silence. Patricia Evans looked like she wanted to say something, but I caught her eye and shook my head slightly. This wasn't the time or place for confrontation. Blake wrapped up his presentation with promises of increased efficiency, reduced costs, and improved working conditions. He scheduled individual meetings with each department head to assess current capabilities and identify optimization opportunities. After the meeting dispersed, several employees approached me privately. They wanted to know what I thought about Blake's plans, whether I believed his promises, and most importantly, what they should do. "Give him a chance," I told each of them. "Change can be good sometimes. Just remember everything you've learned, and don't be afraid to speak up if something doesn't feel right. What I didn't tell them was that I had already set certain wheels in motion. Wheels that Blake Morrison and the executive team at Bramthorne Legal were about to discover had been turning for 15 years. My official last day arrived with all the fanfare of a Tuesday afternoon inventory count. No ceremony, no speeches, just a brief handshake from Catherine Walsh and a standard exit interview form to fill out. After 28 years, I was cleaning out my desk drawers and boxing up the personal items that had made this space feel like a second home. The irony wasn't lost on me that Blake Morrison had scheduled his first major presentation to the executive team for the same day I was walking out the door. Through the conference room's glass walls, I could see him setting up his laptop and arranging his charts with the precision of a man who believed his own hype. As I packed the last of my coffee mugs, Jacob Williams appeared in my doorway. "This isn't right, Darlene," he said, his voice heavy with frustration. "They're making a huge mistake." "Maybe," I replied, wrapping my favorite mug, a gift from the warehouse staff 5 Christmases ago, in tissue paper. "But sometimes companies need to learn lessons the hard way." Jacob stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Is there anything we can do? The whole crew is upset about this. We've been talking, and we're thinking about going to Catherine Walsh as a group, telling her how much you mean to this place." I appreciated the loyalty, but I knew it would only cause trouble for good people who needed their jobs. "Jacob, I want you to listen to me carefully. Don't make waves. Don't fight the new systems Blake is implementing. Do your job, do it well, and let the results speak for themselves." He looked confused, as if he had expected me to encourage resistance, or at least express some bitterness about the situation. But I had learned long ago that the best revenge was often the most patient kind. "Just trust me," I added, closing the box of personal items. "Everything is going to work out exactly as it should." An hour later, I found myself in the unusual position of attending my own replacement's presentation to management. Catherine Walsh had invited me as a courtesy, suggesting that my input might be valuable during the transition period. I suspected she was hoping I would publicly endorse Blake's plans, giving them credibility with the staff who still respected my expertise. The conference room was packed with executives, department heads, and senior managers. Blake had clearly prepared extensively for this moment, with detailed charts, financial projections, and a comprehensive timeline for implementing his recommended changes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his presentation voice polished and confident, "what you're about to see is nothing short of a complete transformation of Bramthorne Legal's warehouse operations. We're not just talking about incremental improvements, we're talking about revolutionary change." His first slide showed a comparison between current costs and projected savings under his new system. The numbers were impressive, promising a 30% reduction in operational expenses within the first year. "The fundamental problem," Blake continued, "is that this warehouse has been operating under antiquated systems designed for a different era. Paper-based tracking, manual inventory counts, outdated safety protocols. These are the hallmarks of an operation that hasn't kept pace with modern logistics management." I sat quietly in my chair, making notes in a small notebook. To any observer, I appeared to be carefully documenting Blake's recommendations. In reality, I was checking items off a mental list that I had been carrying for 15 years. Blake's presentation continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from new software implementations to staff restructuring. He proposed eliminating several positions that he deemed redundant, cross-training remaining employees on multiple systems, and establishing performance metrics that would incentivize excellence and eliminate complacency. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Several executives congratulated him on his thorough analysis and visionary approach. Catherine Walsh beamed as if she had personally discovered the next logistics revolution. "Darlene," she said, turning to me, "as someone who has been so central to our warehouse operations, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Blake's presentation." All eyes turned to me. Blake leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who expected nothing but validation for his brilliance. I smiled and stood up, my notebook in hand. "Blake has certainly done his homework," I said. "His recommendations are very comprehensive." The relief in the room was palpable. "In fact," I continued, "many of his suggestions are remarkably similar to systems that are already documented in our operational procedures. It's impressive how modern logistics principles align so closely with proven methodologies." Blake's smile faltered slightly, as if he sensed something beneath my polite words but couldn't quite identify what it was. The weeks following my departure unfolded exactly as I had predicted. Blake Morrison dove into his modernization project with the enthusiasm of someone who believed he was pioneering uncharted territory. Reports filtered back to me through former colleagues who still called occasionally to vent their frustrations or seek advice. The first casualties of Blake's revolution were the paper-based backup systems I had maintained alongside our digital processes. "Redundant inefficiency," he called them during a staff meeting, according to Patricia Evans. Within a week, he had eliminated the manual tracking logs that had served as our safety net for over a decade. The second change was the inventory software. Blake replaced our current system, which I had spent 3 years customizing to fit our specific needs, with a generic package that promised seamless integration and real-time analytics. The learning curve was steep, and the frequent glitches caused delays that rippled through the entire operation. But the most telling change was Blake's approach to staff scheduling. He implemented what he called dynamic resource allocation, which was essentially a fancy way of saying he would assign people to different departments based on daily workload projections generated by his new software. I had tried dynamic scheduling early in my career and learned why it didn't work in practice. Warehouse operations required institutional knowledge that couldn't be captured in algorithms. Jacob Williams knew exactly which clients had tendency to send irregular shipments. Patricia Evans could spot damaged inventory from across the room. Danny Rodriguez in receiving could predict weather-related delays 3 days in advance, just by watching shipping patterns. But Blake's system treated all workers as interchangeable units, and the results were predictable. Errors increased. Processing times slowed. Customer complaints started trickling in. 3 weeks after my departure, Jacob Williams called me at home on a Friday evening. "Darlene, I don't know what to do," he said, his voice tight with stress. "Everything is falling apart. The new software crashed twice this week. We lost an entire shipment because nobody knew how to read the modified tracking codes, and Blake is blaming the staff for resistance to change." I had been expecting this call. "How are you holding up personally?" "Honestly, I'm thinking about looking for another job. Half the guys on my shift are saying the same thing. This isn't the place we signed up to work for." That was the most dangerous sign of all. Good warehouse employees were hard to find and harder to train. If Blake's changes drove away experienced staff, the damage would compound exponentially. "Jacob, I need you to hang in there a little longer," I said. "I know it's difficult, but trust me when I say that this situation is going to resolve itself soon." "What do you mean?" "Just focus on doing your job as well as you can under the circumstances. Document any problems you encounter, and make sure you're following all safety protocols. And Jacob, when this is over, I think you're going to find that management has a much better appreciation for the people who actually know how to run a warehouse." 2 days later, Patricia called with an update that confirmed my worst fears and my best hopes simultaneously. The new inventory software had miscalculated reorder quantities for 3 major clients, resulting in stock shortages that forced emergency overnight shipping at premium rates. The cost overrun for that single mistake exceeded $10,000. Blake's response was to schedule mandatory retraining sessions for all warehouse staff, as if the problem was their competence rather than his system's design flaws. "He's also bringing in another consultant," Patricia added. "Someone to help with change management and staff optimization." More consultants, more expense, more disruption. The spiral was accelerating exactly as I had seen it happen before, at other companies, under other consultants who confused motion with progress. But this time was different. This time I had been preparing for 15 years. The breaking point came exactly 5 weeks after my retirement, on a Thursday morning that started with what Blake Morrison would later describe as a minor operational hiccup. According to Danny Rodriguez, who called me that afternoon, the hiccup began when Blake's dynamic scheduling system assigned 3 new temporary workers to the receiving department without any experienced supervision. Jacob Williams had been reassigned to shipping, Patricia Evans was covering for someone in filing, and the regular receiving supervisor was attending one of Blake's mandatory training sessions. The temporary workers, following the new standardized procedures that Blake had implemented, processed an incoming shipment of archived legal documents without checking the special handling requirements. The documents, which included original contracts and court filings dating back 30 years, were stored in the standard high-humidity section of the warehouse instead of the climate-controlled archive area. By the time someone noticed the mistake, moisture damage had affected over 200 boxes of irreplaceable legal documents belonging to one of Bramthorne Legal's largest clients, a Fortune 500 company whose retainer alone represented nearly 10% of the firm's annual revenue. The client was not pleased. Blake spent 3 hours in the conference room with the partners, Danny told me. You could hear the shouting through the walls. Something about liability exposure and malpractice insurance and potential lawsuits. I felt a familiar mix of sadness and vindication. Sadness because I genuinely cared about Bramthorne Legal and hated to see the company suffer. Vindication because this was exactly the kind of preventable disaster that experienced warehouse management was designed to avoid. What's Blake saying about it? I asked. He's calling it a training issue. Says the temporary workers didn't follow proper procedures, and that the permanent staff should have been more vigilant about oversight. Of course he was. Consultants never blamed systems failures on systemic problems. It was always implementation issues or user error or insufficient commitment to the change process. But the partners at Bramthorne Legal were lawyers, which meant they understood liability and accountability in ways that made them less susceptible to consultant double talk. When your business was built on managing legal risk for other people, you didn't have much patience for operational failures that created new risks for your own company. The damaged documents represented potential lawsuits, insurance claims, and, at minimum, the cost of recreating decades of legal work. Even if the client didn't terminate their relationship with the firm, the incident would strain trust and potentially affect contract renewals. That evening, I received an unexpected phone call from Catherine Walsh. Her voice carried a strain I had never heard before. "Darlene, I hope you don't mind me calling you at home," she began. "I wanted to discuss the possibility of bringing you back as a consultant to help us through some transition challenges we're experiencing." I almost smiled. The word consultant had apparently become the universal solution to every corporate problem, even when the problem was caused by consultants in the first place. "What kind of challenges?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We've had some operational difficulties since Blake implemented his new systems. Nothing insurmountable, but the partners feel it would be beneficial to have someone with your institutional knowledge available to provide guidance." Operational difficulties. That was corporate speak for expensive disaster that's threatening our client relationships. "I appreciate the offer, Catherine," I replied. "But I'm afraid I'm not available for consulting work." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Perhaps we could discuss compensation," she said finally. "The partners are prepared to be quite generous." "It's not about money," I said, which was true enough. "It's about timing. But Catherine, you might want to check my employment file. There may be some contractual issues that need to be addressed before we could even consider any kind of consulting arrangement." I hung up knowing that by morning, someone would be pulling my personnel records. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually filled me with energy and optimism. I was in my kitchen, enjoying my second cup of coffee and reading the morning news, when my phone rang at exactly 9:15 a.m. The caller was Robert Chen. No, wait, I caught myself. The caller was Robert Harrison from Bramthorne Legal's corporate counsel office. His voice carried the carefully neutral tone that lawyers used when they were about to deliver news that nobody wanted to hear. "Mr. Harrison," I said pleasantly, "what can I do for you?" "Miss Whitaker, I'm calling regarding a contractual clause that was brought to my attention yesterday evening. Specifically, a provision in your 2009 employment agreement that I need to discuss with you." I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring both the warmth and the moment. Oh, that old thing. I wondered when someone would remember to check on that. According to our records, there is a clause, Section 12(7), that guarantees additional compensation in the event that your documented operational procedures are utilized by outside consultants during a 5-year period following your departure from the company. "That's correct," I confirmed. "Is there a problem with that clause?" The pause that followed was loaded with implications. "Miss Whitaker, could you clarify exactly what procedures this clause covers?" I had been waiting 15 years to answer that question. "Well, Mr. Harrison, it covers any and all operational procedures that I documented during my tenure at Bramthorne Legal. The inventory tracking systems, safety protocols, scheduling methodologies, quality control checklists, emergency response procedures, equipment maintenance schedules, and staff training protocols." Another pause. "And the compensation structure outlined in this clause?" "Triple my final year's salary, payable within 30 days of utilization by outside consultants," I said, reciting the language I had memorized word for word. "Plus, interest calculated at the prime rate, plus 2% from the date of my departure." I could practically hear him calculating the numbers. My final year's salary had been $87,000. Triple that amount, plus 15 years of accumulated interest, represented a substantial sum. "Miss Whitaker," he said carefully, "do you have documentation that these procedures are currently being used by Mr. Morrison's consulting firm?" I smiled at the coffee cup. "Mr. Harrison, I have Blake Morrison's own PowerPoint presentation, delivered to the executive team on my last day, in which he explicitly recommends implementing every single system I developed over the past 15 years. He just called them by different names and presented them as innovative solutions." The silence stretched so long I began to wonder if the call had been disconnected. "Mr. Harrison, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here. Miss Whitaker, I think we need to schedule a meeting to discuss this matter in detail." "Of course," I replied. "I'm available at your convenience. Should I bring my attorney?" That might be advisable. By Monday morning, the situation at Bramthorne Legal had escalated beyond anyone's expectations. My attorney, Margaret Foster, had spent the weekend reviewing my employment contracts and preparing a formal demand for payment under the terms of Section 12.7. The numbers were staggering. Triple my final salary amounted to $261,000. 15 years of accumulated interest brought the total to just over $400,000. But the real shock came when Margaret's research revealed that the clause also included provisions for legal fees and punitive damages if payment was delayed beyond the 30-day requirement. Catherine Walsh called me directly at 8 a.m., bypassing the lawyers and the formal protocols. Her voice was strained, and I could hear the exhaustion that came from spending an entire weekend in crisis management mode. "Darlene, please tell me there's some way we can resolve this amicably," she said without preamble. "What do you mean?" I asked, genuinely curious about her definition of amicable. "The partners are concerned about the financial implications of this clause. They're asking whether there might be room for negotiation." I considered her request carefully. The truth was, I didn't need $400,000. My retirement savings were adequate, my house was paid off, and my needs were simple. But this wasn't really about the money anymore. It was about principle, respect, and the value of institutional knowledge. "Catherine, I spent 28 years building systems that worked. Systems that kept people safe, kept costs down, and kept clients happy. Your company just paid a consultant an enormous fee to recommend implementing the exact same systems I designed 15 years ago. I understand your frustration." This isn't about frustration, I interrupted gently. This is about honoring contracts and recognizing value. The clause exists because I saw this exact scenario coming 15 years ago. What would it take to settle this quietly? I already knew my answer. Payment in full, as specified in the contract, plus Blake Morrison's immediate termination, plus my retirement bonus, which should never have been denied in the first place. The silence told me everything I needed to know about how desperate the situation had become. By Friday afternoon, my bank account showed a deposit of $423,000. Blake Morrison had been terminated that morning, effective immediately. My original retirement bonus had been processed and would arrive within 10 business days. But the real satisfaction came from a phone call I received that evening from Jacob Williams. Darlene, I don't know what you did, but Blake is gone and they're asking the warehouse staff to go back to using your old systems until they can find a permanent replacement for him. And how does that feel? I asked. Like coming home, he said. The lesson was simple. Experience has value, loyalty should be reciprocated, and contracts should be read carefully before they're signed. Bramthorne Legal had learned all 3 lessons the expensive way, but they had learned them thoroughly. As I looked toward the future, I couldn't help but smile at the irony that my greatest professional victory had come not from building something new, but from having the foresight to protect something I had already built. Sometimes the best revenge truly was a dish served cold and garnished with compound interest.